Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to introduce Javier del Barco, our speaker tonight. Professor del Barco is associate professor at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, the institution where he received his doctorate in Hebrew philology in 2001. And between 2007 and 2021, he held the position of senior researcher at the Spanish National Research Council's Institute for Mediterranean and Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. Professor del Barco is a leading authority on the study and interpretation of medieval Hebrew manuscripts in general, and perhaps the most authoritative living scholar of Hebrew biblical codices certainly in the Western Mediterranean ambit. This approach and his approach to the material was exemplified by the virtuoso workshop he conducted last Thursday here at the CAJS Center, and I know many of you were there as well, around our own MS Codex 1052. And we saw in this wonderful 2.5-hour event that kept everyone really captivated that Professor del Barco's approach centers on codicological, paleographical, and material aspects of the book, interrogating these aspects to kind of consider and build a broader argument about issues of transmission, production, and circulation. Professor del Barco has published incredibly widely, including a contribution to the recent Festschrift celebrating David Stern, and in that he discussed the typology of medieval Hebrew Bibles, and he's recently also published a study of the glosses found in Oxford Bodleian Library, MS Hunt 268, which appeared in 2021. He's also edited an important collection of essays entitled The Late Medieval Hebrew Book in the Western Mediterranean, which was published by Brill in 2015. And his work extends, and this is important to mention, to valuable scholarly catalogs of Hebrew manuscripts, including those from libraries in Madrid, from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and from the monastic library of Montserrat in Catalonia. And for those of us who are perhaps outside the immediate area of his scholarly expertise, his contributions in the form of wide-ranging survey articles, such as an article entitled From Scroll to Codex, Dynamics of Text Layout Transformations in the Hebrew Bible, and La Producción de Libros Hebreos en la Península Ibérica, una panorámica global. These sorts of articles allow us to understand the commonalities and distinctions that constitute Hebrew book production in the pre-modern Iberian context. Tonight, he'll be focusing his attention on two distinctive items from the Katz Center's collection in a talk entitled The Sephardic Bible Bookcraft, Codicology, Layout, and Contents in Two Manuscripts at the Library of the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. Please help me to welcome Professor del Barco.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for these so generous introductions. At some moments, I was thinking that you were talking about someone else, not me. But really, thank you. I'm extremely thankful for being here. This has been an extremely grateful and productive week and a half, some 10 days that I've been working here, and it's been, these days have been extremely pleasant and I think fruitful as well. So thank you very much. I would like to extend, of course, I thank the Schoenberg Institute for manuscript studies, and also I would like to thank the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, the University of Pennsylvania in general, of course, and the Jewish Studies program as well. And well, thank you very much indeed. Now let me start with what I think it's a simple but a challenging question. What makes a Bible Sephardic? Is it only the type of script or its material features, such as the preparation of parchment and the composition of quires? What other elements concerning Bible production and bookcraft might help us define a Bible as Sephardic? This is why the aim of this lecture is to determine, or I will try to determine whether, in addition to these strict material and paleographical features, there are other elements specifically characteristic of Sephardic Bibles. Elements related to the selection, organization, and layouts of their texts, as opposed to the Bibles produced in other Jewish cultural regions of medieval Europe. In other words, I will discuss some elements that could be meaningful to the definition of a Bible as Sephardic. I shall begin by clarifying what I mean by the term Sephardic here. With Sephardic, I'm not referring to the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula or to their descendants after the expulsion from Spain at the end of the 15th century. But rather, here, the term Sephardic is used to refer to a medieval geocultural area defined by a particular way of producing Hebrew books. Malachi Betarieh defines Sepharad in terms of typological characterization of bookcraft and script as a region including not only the Iberian Peninsula in its entirety, but also Bas-Languedoc and Provence in the north of the Iberian Peninsula, and North Africa and Morocco to Tunisia in the south, and Sicily in the Mediterranean. According to him, the Sephardic manuscript combined the characteristics of Hebrew bookcraft in northern Spain, which was under Christian rule since the consolidation of the Hebrew Codex, exposed continuously to Latin bookcraft, and those which prevailed further south in the territories that were immersed in Arabic book culture under Muslim rule when Hebrew bookcraft was taking shape. Furthermore, Betarieh suggests that Sephardic bookcraft and script originated in Muslim Iberia, that is, Al-Andalus, rather than in Christian Iberia, due to the fact that many of the main traits of the Sephardic type, and I quote, were visible already in the earlier 10th and 11th century manuscripts produced in Tunisia and in the Middle East by immigrants from the Maghreb, end quote. Therefore, he also suggests that the roots of Jewish Iberian bookcraft might have been in Tunisia, particularly around the Talmudic scholarship and Torah study center of Qayrawan. However, even if we accept that Sephardic bookcraft originated in North Africa, it was in Al-Andalus where it must have crystallized. And from there, it spread to the Christian North, evolving under the influence of Latin and vernacular bookcraft. So we can start from the generally accepted idea that there existed a particular way of producing Hebrew books in Sepharad, at least in terms of their material composition and script, which differed from that of other geocultural regions of medieval Europe, such as Ashkenaz, Italy, or Byzantium. In addition, I will try to analyze whether there are other elements, besides materiality and paleography, specifically related to Sephardic Hebrew Bibles that might reflect a particular way, perhaps, of conceiving and shaping them as a category of book distinct from Hebrew Bibles produced in other Jewish geocultural areas. So, okay, this is... to that end, we are going to examine two Sephardic biblical manuscripts housed in the library of the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, namely Manuscript 620 and Manuscript 364. You have them also on the table, and you can see there that from From a material point of view, the two manuscripts are quite different, as you can see. In the case of manuscript C120, it consists solely of a bifolium, or sheet, as you can see, taken from a Hebrew Bible codex. In the other case, manuscript 364 is a codex of the Pentateuch with Haftarot, that is the prophetic readings, lacking several folios, a number of which have been replaced with leaves from an incunable printed edition, which we will discuss later. Now, despite these differences, obvious differences, both manuscripts show a series of features relating to the selection, organization, and arrangement of their texts that fall within the Sephardic tradition, some of which, in fact, might be considered relevant for defining the Sephardic Hebrew Bible in terms that go beyond its material aspect and script type. Let us begin with manuscript 620. As I mentioned, it consists of a single bifolium that contains, in columns at the center of the page, the Hebrew text of Deuteronomy 32:47 up to 35:9 in the folio on the right. And the text then continues on the folio on the left on what was the conjugate leaf in Ecclesiastes or Kohelet, beginning with 3:10 and ending with 5:13. This means that, as was customary in medieval codices, this bifolium, of course, formed part of a choir or gathering, that is a set of bifolia folded together down the middle. Although we cannot determine the number of bifolia in the original choir, we do know that the most common type of choir in Sepharad was the quaternion, or choir of 4 bifolia, that is, 8 folios in total. The fact that the end of the Pentateuch and the book of Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, are found on the same bifolium strongly suggests that the choir from which it came belonged to a Hebrew Bible codex that contained first the Pentateuch or Torah, followed by the 5 scrolls, or Chamesh Megillot, so called because in the synagogue they were read from a scroll. So in Hebrew, Megillah, scroll on the holidays associated with each. Ruth on Shavuot, Song of Songs on Pesach, Ecclesiastes on Sukkot, Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, and particularly Esther on Purim, the reading of the latter remaining very popular even today. Since the first folio, the one on the right, ends at Deuteronomy 34:9, and the next begins at Ecclesiastes 3:10, the missing text from both books amounts to only about 3.5 verses of Deuteronomy and just over 2 chapters of Ecclesiastes. Nevertheless, it would be extremely unusual for Ecclesiastes to be the first of the 5 scrolls, since in medieval Hebrew Bibles, it typically occupies the 3rd or 4th position within them. And the famous Kennicott Bible, for example, which may be regarded as the epitome of the Sephardic biblical tradition, the 5 scrolls appear in the order Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. That is, before Ecclesiastes come the books of Ruth and Song of Songs. Could this have been the case in this Bible? If we look at folio 2 verso, we can see that in the lower left corner there is a catchword, that is the first word of the following choir. Catchwords in choirs made of parchment, as in this case, were usually written only at the end of the choir, that is, on the verso of the last folio, to ensure that the bookbinder would place them in the correct order. Therefore, we must assume that this bifolium is the outer bifolium of the choir from which it comes, and that consequently 3 bifolia, meaning 6 folios, are missing between them. Could it be that within those 6 folios there was enough space to contain the final text of Deuteronomy, the books of Ruth, Song of Songs, and the first 2.5 chapters of Ecclesiastes? In the Connecticut Bible just mentioned, the books of Ruth and Song of Songs, along with the first 2.5 chapters of Ecclesiastes, occupy nearly 5 full folios. In our Bible, since the number of lines per column is smaller than in the Connecticut Bible, those same texts would have required slightly more space, perhaps about 5.5 folios. That is 11 pages. Since the end of Deuteronomy and thus of the Pentateuch would occupy 1 page, leaving the rest of that folio blank so that the 5 scrolls begin on the next page, we can estimate that a total of 12 pages, meaning 6 folios or 3 bifolia, would be needed to account for the fact that in our Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes followed Ruth and Song of Songs. Therefore, we can confidently conclude that our bifolium is missing the 3 middle bifolia of the choir, which would have contained the end of Deuteronomy on 1 page and the books of Ruth and Song of Songs together with the first 2.5 chapters of Ecclesiastes on the remaining pages. However, aside from these codicological technical details that allow us to reconstruct the choir with confidence, what is undoubtedly more interesting is the text we find in the upper and lower margins of folio 1, that is, the folio containing the end of Deuteronomy. The arrangement of the biblical text into columns with 2 lines of much smaller writing in the upper margin and 3 in the lower margin immediately identifies this page as following the most common layout of medieval Hebrew Bibles with Masorah. The annotations concerning the spelling and other features of the biblical text, which we find already in the earliest surviving medieval codices, such as the Aleppo Codex or the Leningrad Codex. If we compare this, for example, with the Connecticut Bible, which is a Masoretic Bible, that is, one with Masorah, we will observe that the layout is identical to that of our bifolium. It features 2 columns of biblical text, along with 2 lines of micrographic writing in the upper margin and 3 in the lower. From the 10th century onward and through the Middle Ages, a great number of Bibles were copied both in the East and in Europe following this same page layout, which, because its earliest known use appears in the Iberian Masoretic codices, I have elsewhere referred to as Tiberian layout. It was precisely the great success of the Masoretic Bible, and by extension the page layout used in it, this layout, that led to the production of other kinds of Bibles in which the same layout was adopted. Even though these were not truly Bibles with Masorah, their visual appearance was identical, as in the case of our bifolium here. Contrary to what occurs in Masoretic Bibles, the text copied in the upper and lower margins here is not the Masorah. In our case, the text is that of the Megillat Antiochus, the rabbinic work written in Babylonian Aramaic that recounts the victory of the Maccabees over the Hellenistic Seleucid dynasty of Syria-Palestine. It is not unusual to find Sephardic Bible manuscripts with Tiberian layout in which instead of the Masorah, the upper and lower margins are used to copy a different text. while still maintaining the traditional visual appearance of Bibles with Masorah. If we look at the page layout in Manuscript Paris, National Library of France, Hebrew 73, a 13th or 14th century Bible written in Sephardic script, we would certainly describe it as having a Tiberian layout. The main text in the center occupies 2 columns per page, while in the upper and lower margins there are 3 and 4 lines respectively of micrographic text, and the Masorah Parva is located between the columns. Such a layout immediately suggests a Bible with Masorah, yet the contents of this Bible correspond to an entirely different type. In this case, a liturgical Pentateuch or Chumash that contains, alongside the biblical text, the Targum Onkelos and Rashi's commentary. Here, the 2 central columns contain the biblical text, alternating verse by verse with the Targum Onkelos, without any visual distinction between them, as they do not occupy separate spaces, nor are they written in different letter sizes or script types. In addition, Rashi's commentary is copied in micrography in the upper and lower margins, precisely where the Masorah Magna would appear in a Masoretic Bible. A much more relevant example in our context is these other manuscript from Paris as well, National Library of France, Hebrew 47. This is a small format liturgical Pentateuch or Chumash, measuring some 15 centimeters per 10, copied in the 15th century in Sephardic square script. This too represents something similar to the Tiberian layout. We would say the biblical text appears in the center of the page, in this case in a single column due to the codex's small size, with 3 and 4 lines of micrographic text, not so micrographic, but smaller text anyway, in the upper and lower margins respectively. However, despite the use of this kind of Tiberian layout, this is not a Bible with Masorah, since it does not contain the Masorah. In fact, it is a liturgical Pentateuch or with Haftarot and the 5 scrolls. The text copied in micrography in the upper and lower margins with the same visual appearance as the Masorah Magna contains first the Haftarot, then the 5 scrolls, and finally the Megillat Antiochus, just as in our bifolium, copied as secondary marginal text accompanying the Pentateuch throughout the manuscript. This brings us to the following question, which is, could it be that the Haftarot were also copied in the Bible from which our bifolium comes from in the upper and lower margins of the Pentateuch, and then the Megillat Antiochus followed, but just in the final folios of the Pentateuch? In the Kennicott Bible, again, the complete Pentateuch occupies 110 folios. In our Bible, it would have required more, since the number of lines per column is smaller than in the Kennicott Bible. So, considering the brevity of the Megillat Antiochus, which, when copied continuously, takes up to 4 or 5 folios, no more than 15 or 20 folios would have been needed to copy the full text using the 5 lines in the margins of each page. We must therefore assume that in our Bible, the Megillat Antiochus was copied in the margins of the final portion of the Pentateuch, following another text that had been copied in the margins of the preceding part of the Pentateuch. While we cannot be certain that this other text was the Haftarot, some evidence points in that direction. First, we have the example of the just mentioned manuscript Paris, National Library of France, Hebrew 47. in which both the Haftarot and the Megillat Antiochus are copied in the margins, normally reserved for the Masorah. Second, in our manuscript, we have noted that the 5 scrolls were copied immediately after the Pentateuch. Although this is most common in Ashkenazic Bibles from Central Europe, in the Iberian Peninsula it was more usual to find, following the Pentateuch, first the Haftarot and then the 5 scrolls. This is the case, for instance, in a Sephardic liturgical Pentateuch preserved at the National Library of Spain. It is manuscript 5469, where we find, after the Pentateuch, first the Haftarot and finally the 5 scrolls. The same occurs in manuscript 364 from the Katz Library Center, which we will discuss in a moment, where the Haftarot begin immediately after the text of the Pentateuch. The fact that in our bivolume here, the 5 scrolls appear immediately after the Pentateuch may therefore indicate that the Haftarot had already been copied elsewhere. In this case, I think, perhaps in the upper and lower margins of the Pentateuch itself, just like the Megillat Antiochus. At this point, at least one final question remains concerning this bivolume, one that relates specifically to the presence of the text of the Megillat Antiochus. To what extent is the copying of the Megillat Antiochus alongside the biblical text rooted in the Sephardic tradition? Could it be considered an equivocal feature of the Sephardic biblical tradition? In the absence of quantitative data regarding the presence of this text in Sephardic Hebrew Bibles, we can nonetheless affirm that the inclusion of the Megillat Antiochus alongside the biblical text in our Bible is not an isolated phenomenon within the medieval Sephardic context. There are numerous examples of Sephardic Bibles in which this text appears, either copied in the margins, as is our case, or copied after the biblical text. We see this, for example, in a Sephardic Bible copied in Tudela in 1300 by the famous scribe Yoshua ben Avraham ben Gaon of Soria, and in another copied in Tarazona in 1482 by the scribe Yom Tov ben Yitzhak Amarillo. Another particularly significant case is this manuscript, a Hebrew Bible in Paris, the National Library of France. This is manuscript Hebrew 29, which was copied in Castile in the second half of the 15th century. At the beginning of the manuscript, before the start of the text of Genesis, we find 2 quires containing various texts. In the center of the page are copied different Masoretic lists, something very common in Sephardic Bibles, along with the list of the positive and negative mitzvot of the Pentateuch. That is, biblical text or text directly related to the Bible. The texts framing the pages, both large and small, again include Masoretic lists as well as verses from Genesis, Proverbs, Song of Songs, Psalms, and the Prophets, together with excerpts from the Megillat Antiochus. In other words, once again, we find biblical or biblically related material, such as the Masoretic lists, and in this case, the Megillat Antiochus. This reveals, in my opinion, that the Megillat Antiochus was regarded in the Sephardic cultural context as a text closely connected to the Bible, so much so that it was copied or appended quite naturally within Hebrew Bible manuscripts. We even have a romanceado, that is Old Castilian translation of the Megillat Antiochus, preserved in a biblical manuscript dated between 1420 and 1430, which contains the so-called Pentateuch, that is the Pentateuch, along with the books of Joshua and Judges, and the Megillat Antiochus, all translated into medieval Castilian, most likely by Castilian Jews. This is a well-known Bible of Ajuda, so called because it is preserved today in the Ajuda Royal Palace in Lisbon. And I'm sorry, because this is one of the few images that I was able to get from this Bible. It's not even an entire folio, just a column, but I just wanted to give you at least an image of this Bible. All this leads us to conclude that the association of the Megillat Antiochus with the biblical text was common in the medieval Sephardic world, probably due to the tradition of reading this text on the Shabbat of Hanukkah, a custom also known in other traditions outside the Iberian Peninsula. But this is just a suggestion. Well, at this point, I would like to return to something I mentioned earlier, which is the notably uncommon practice in medieval Sephardic Bibles of copying the 5 scrolls immediately after the Pentateuch. This aspect, in my opinion, has not been sufficiently studied or quantified in medieval Bibles, yet it constitutes one of the defining characteristics of Sephardic Hebrew Bibles of the liturgical Pentateuch or Chumash type. To develop this argument, I will turn now to the other manuscript, manuscript 364 in the library of the Katz Center, a Sephardic Bible produced according to the catalog record in the first half of the 14th century. This Bible is composed of quaternions, that is, quires made up of 4 bifolia of parchment, meaning 8 folios per quire, which begin on the hair side and therefore, in the middle of the quire, display the hair side as well, because as usual, 2 facing pages should display the same type of side, hair or flesh, and so they alternate from one opening to the following. This is common to most medieval manuscripts, so this is not something particular of Hebrew manuscripts. The quaternion was the standard quire in Sepharad throughout the entire Middle Ages, since the use of other types of quires, such as the ternion, 3 bifolia per quire, or the senion, 6 bifolia per quire, was rare and limited in both time and place. Beginning the quire on the hair side was also the standard practice in Sepharad throughout the Middle Ages. Although in the 14th and 15th century, we also find some parchment manuscripts that begin on the flesh side. The type of quire used here, therefore, tells us only that this Bible is of Sephardic production, but it provides no clues that would allow us to determine its date or place of origin more precisely. The ruling also does not help us in this case to establish a much narrower time frame. It can be observed that the ruling was carried out with hard point, 2 folios at the same time on the hair side, according to their sequence in the quire, usually following the order of the quire, except for the last 2 folios, which are usually ruled from the end of the quire. Sometimes, if the ruling on the first folio has not left a sufficient mark on the second folio, showing the flesh side, this second folio is ruled again. Now, according to Betarier, and I quote, the standard ruling in Sepharad throughout all the time periods was by hard point on the hair side. In manuscripts that were also pricked in the inner margins, several folios ruled in one go, usually 2, but sometimes more, end quote. So the type of ruling we find here, 2 folios in one go on the hair side, according to the sequence of the choir, corresponds to what Betarieh describes as standard and represents a practice attested in Sepharad throughout all the time periods. The pricking, however, slightly reduces the time frame in which this manuscript could have been produced. Here we find double margin prickings, that is, perforations that guided the ruling on both the inner and outer margins, which is expected if the ruling was done on the folio and not on the unfolded bifolium. This double margin pricking was the norm until the mid-14th century, and not so much after that date, as suggested by what is found in Hebrew dated manuscripts. Therefore, from these very technical and codicological considerations, and particularly from the double margin pricking, we can suggest that this manuscript was produced before the second half of the 14th century. If this is true, this would coincide with what is suggested by the catalog record. Nevertheless, it should be noted that a production date later than mid-14th century would also be possible. In any case, this Bible is especially well known because it contains 6 folios from the incunable edition of the Pentateuch, Haftarot, and 5 scrolls, printed by Eliezer ben Avraham Alantansi in the Aragonese town of Ichar in 1487 or 1489. Only 14 copies or fragments of this edition are known worldwide, so the presence of these folios is undoubtedly one of the manuscript's chief points of interest. Nevertheless, I would like to focus on 2 aspects of this Bible that, in my view, represent 2 defining features of the Sephardic biblical tradition. In this manuscript, as I mentioned earlier, the Pentateuch is followed immediately by the Haftarot. There can be no doubt that this was the scribe's intention, since the Pentateuch ends on folio 175 recto, and the Haftarot begin on the verso of the same folio. So here we have both sides of the same folio. The Pentateuch on the recto on the right, and the verso of the same folio on the left. So we have Haftarot lechol hashana, and then Bereshit, the Haftarah for Parashat Bereshit. The manuscript lacks several folios at both the beginning and end, as well as some internal folios, some of which, as we have seen, have been replaced with leaves from Alantansi's printed incunable edition. The Haftarot for the entire year, as indicated by the title, at the beginning, Haftarot lechol hashana, extends in our manuscript up to Parashat Ekev, which contains the text of Isaiah 49:14 to 51:3. But in this manuscript, the text breaks off at Isaiah 49:18. And then the Haftarot for the remaining parashot of Deuteronomy are therefore missing. After the Haftarot, it is most likely that in the complete original manuscript, the 5 scrolls followed, thus continuing the model represented, for example, by the already mentioned manuscript of the National Library of Spain, 5469, a Bible very similar to the one we are examining here. So we have here the beginning of the Haftarot as well. Haftarot shel kol hashana, in this case, and Haftarot lekol hashana. In this Bible, we also find immediately after the end of the Pentateuch the beginning of the Haftarot on the verso of the same folio, as can be seen on this slide. The Haftarah for holidays and festivals are also included in their proper chronological places among the Haftarot for the entire year. Then the Haftarot end on folio 293, and on that same page in the next column, the 5 scrolls begin, starting with the book of Ruth. The order of the 5 scrolls here is as follows in this manuscript. Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. Precisely the same sequence we have suggested for the 5 scrolls in the bifolium from the Katz Center, which we discussed in the first part of this lecture. This sequence, Haftarot first, followed by the 5 scrolls, is undoubtedly the one that would have appeared in the complete original version of the Bible under discussion here now. Al-Antansi's own Bible, which is likewise a Chumash with Haftarot and 5 scrolls, follows the same sequence of text. The Haftarot for the entire year come immediately after the Pentateuch, while the 5 scrolls appear at the end of the book, following the Haftarot. Despite the fact that even on the website of the Incunabula short title catalog, the Al-Antansi Bible is listed as containing Torah, Megillot, Haftarot, instead of Torah, Haftarot, Megillot. This mistake, undoubtedly unintentional, nonetheless reveals how deeply ingrained it is within the non-Sephardic European Jewish tradition that in Chumash, the 5 scrolls should come immediately after the Pentateuch, rather than after the Haftarot, as is more common in the Sephardic tradition. But the similarities between the Katz Center Bible, the manuscript from the National Library of Spain, and the Al-Antansi Bible are not limited to the order of the books. Another very interesting feature to analyze is the layout of the poetic sections of the Pentateuch, because of the variations it presents across the different regional scribal traditions of the various Jewish geocultural areas. Of the 2 principal poetic sections, Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, and Shirat HaAzinu, the Song of Moses, we will focus on the first, Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, and on a specific layout tradition that appears in a noteworthy number of Sephardic Hebrew Bibles. Maimonides, in his Mishneh Torah, Hilchot Sefer Torah, defines the arrangement of the text of both the Song of the Sea and the Song of Moses according to the Masoretic Ben Asher tradition. Maimonides had access to this tradition in Egypt by consulting authoritative Masoretic codices, which he claims to have used for a copy he himself made of a Torah scroll. According to him, and I quote, the Song of the Sea is written in 30 lines. The first line is normal, meaning with no blank spaces in the line, while the rest are as follows. One line has an empty space in the middle, while the next line has 2 empty spaces, so that the line is divided into 3, and so that there is space opposite each written part, and writing opposite each space. End quote. Immediately after, as can be seen in this manuscript, which is manuscript in Oxford, in the Bodleian Library, a copy of the Mishneh Torah corrected according to Maimonides' original, he offers the text of the poem and the form that it should taken when copied. Maimonides not only takes up the ancient tradition of laying the text out in this brick pattern, with spaces and text, but also specifies the number of blank spaces that each line should have, 2 in one line, starting with line 2. And now, what is this the, yeah. So, this is line 1, as you can see. He said that the line 1 is normal, so with no spaces, right? And then starting line 2, we have 2 spaces, and then in the following 1 space, and then alternatively 1 and 2 spaces, so that there is written space, or there is a space and written lines alternating throughout the poem. As for lines 29-30 of the poem, which we can see, so this is the beginning of the poem, and then the 30 lines, and here we have line 29, right, and line 30 here. So Maimonides does not give any direct indication about how they should be copied, but the model we find here in this manuscript displays line 29 and 30 with one space each. Line 29 with a space towards the end, and line 30 with a space towards the beginning. So in line 29, this space towards the end, and here a space towards the beginning of the line. This is the tradition followed by most medieval Eastern codices of the Hebrew Bible. In addition to these guidelines, Maimonides mentions other scribal practices that also concern the text layout of the Song of the Sea, and I quote, "Other practices not mentioned in the Talmud, which scribes customarily do according to their traditions, are that the 5 lines preceding the Song of the Sea begin with the words Habaim, Bayevasha, Adonai, Met, Bemitzrayim, and that the 5 lines following the Song of the Sea begin with the words Vatikach, Acharea, Sus, Vayetzu, Vayavo." End quote. These practices are not mandatory in the copy of medieval codices of the Hebrew Bible. They're just mandatory for the copy of Torah scrolls. And in fact, Bible codices present divergent traditions according to the different geocultural areas. And sometimes these practices are not followed at all, except for the shape of the poem in the typical brick pattern. However, in the Sephardic tradition, it is very common for all these practices to be observed, and in some cases for a specific layout to be adopted. One of the most distinctive layouts of the Sephardic tradition, and one that can be considered characteristic of it, is the arrangement of the Song of the Sea, including the 5-line paragraphs before and after it, across 2 facing pages with 21 lines written on the page. In fact, this layout simply transposes the standard Torah scroll column of 42 lines containing the Song of the Sea onto 2 separate pages. Altogether, following Maimonides, the poem and its preceding and following paragraphs occupy 42 lines. 5 for each of the preceding and following paragraphs, 10 in total, 30 for the poem itself, and 2 blank lines, because we have blank lines between the preceding paragraph and the start of the poem, and after the end of the poem and the following paragraph, so 2 blank lines. The Katz Center Bible on the screen, this is this manuscript, displays precisely this layout, just like the Bible of the National Library of Spain, and as well as the Al-Antansi Bible. In other Sephardic Bibles, the layout may differ, since either the size of the folio or the width of the columns do not always allow for the text to be arranged across 2 facing pages of 21 lines each. Nevertheless, this layout is one of the most characteristic scribal strategies of the Sephardic tradition, which also emphasizes the symbolism and importance of the poem by granting it full prominence when the book is opened to those pages. Furthermore, the symmetry of the text's arrangement provides an aesthetic balance that was surely highly valued by both the scribes themselves and the patrons who commissioned the Bibles. All in all, this Aesthetic innovation, which many Sephardic scribes made their own, became one of the most iconic features of the layout of the Song of the Sea in the Sephardic tradition. To conclude, the examination of these two Sephardic biblical manuscripts preserved in the Katz Center library, in dialogue with other examples such as the Codicological Bible, manuscript 5469 of the National Library of Spain, and the Chumash printed by Eliezer ben Avraham Alantansi in Icha, allows us to outline with greater precision some of the defining features of the Sephardic biblical tradition and bookcraft. Beyond the material particularities of each codex, structural and conceptual constants emerge that reveal a coherent and enduring conception of the biblical codex within the cultural context of medieval Sepharad. In the absence of quantitative studies providing reliable data about the absence or presence of these constants, we can nonetheless identify some elements particularly relevant in the Sephardic Bible tradition that are hardly found in other European geocultural areas. Foremost among these elements is the characteristic textual sequence of the Sephardic Chumash, the Pentateuch followed by the Haftarot and finally the 5 scrolls. The sequence, attested both in manuscripts and in early printed editions, departs from the arrangement most commonly found in other European Jewish traditions, where the 5 scrolls are placed immediately after the Pentateuch. It is not entirely clear what the origin and function of this practice are, if it is related to the Oriental tradition, or if the ritual practice of reading the Haftarah after the weekly parasha might be behind of such a sequence, and therefore further research on this topic is in order. A second distinctive feature is the integration of texts considered closely related or complementary to the Bible, such as the Megillat Antiochus. Its presence, whether copied in the margins or following the biblical text, should not be understood as an isolated or exceptional phenomenon, but rather as a further example of the permeability of the concept of biblical canon or close to canon works in the medieval Sephardic world. The proximity of the Megillat Antiochus to the biblical text, as well as its medieval Castilian translation in the Bible of Ajuda, reveals an expanded and functional conception of Scripture that extends beyond the canonical boundaries of the Hebrew Bible. Finally, codicological and formal aspects, such as the layout of poetic sections, particularly that of the Song of the Sea, confirmed the existence of shared scribal conventions that helped define the visual identity of the Sephardic Bible. These conventions respond not only to aesthetic considerations, but also to the possible identification of the biblical codex as an almost sacred object, in a way similar to the scroll. The identification of the Sephardic biblical codices with the temple, reflected in the popular term Mikdashia, given to many Sephardic Bibles, could reinforce this idea of the codex as an almost sacred object in the Sephardic context. Taken together, these elements, the textual sequence, the integration of related works, and the visual configuration of the page, allow us to affirm that the Sephardic Bible bookcraft is defined not merely by its material features, such as the preparation of the parchment, the composition of the quires, and the type of script, but by an integrated particular conception of the Bible as a liturgical, didactic, sacred, and cultural object. The manuscripts examined here, thus, embody a distinctly Sephardic way of producing, reading, copying, and interpreting the Hebrew Bible, one that combines fidelity to the tradition with the remarkable personality of its own. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that fantastic talk. I hope you're willing to take a few questions from
Of course,
the room.
yeah.
Let me get the microphone.
Hi, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. The big question that I want to ask is who were these books for and where did they have them? It seems like in general, given the layout and the selection of texts, that it would be used during a service, like a Shabbat or festival service, because those are the exact texts that would be read. The portion of Torah and the Haftarah, and if it was a festival, the Megillah. But some of the versions that you were talking about, if I understood them correctly, would make some of that a little bit difficult, particularly the ones where there might have been texts in the Masorah margins on the top and the bottom. So that's a little confusing to me. And a small question I just want to fit in is, when you're asking what makes a Sephardic Bible, I'm assuming that the versions of the Haftarot are the Sephardic selections of those Haftarot, and which differ from the Ashkenaz.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for these interesting questions. First of all, concerning where did these manuscripts, where they used these manuscripts. It's not probable that they used them in the synagogue. It's not probable they use it there, of course, because, but they did have these manuscripts at home, and they were used probably for study. Even if you don't use it in the synagogue, you want to have one of these chumash to know the order of the Haftarot, to know you have the Torah, the complete Torah with the parashot. And then you have the Haftarot in the order of your community, so you can read them, beforehand, before going to the synagogue and study them. So it is my assumption that, not only mine, but it is a general assumption that these Chumashim, let's say, these liturgical Pentateuchs, were mostly used at home, right? And then the question on the Masorah, it's very interesting, because you said that you were confused about these very micrographic texts. We're all confused about it, really, because there's this big discussion about, was the Masorah actually read, by the honors of the books, because sometimes it's written in a so small and micrographic script that it's very hard to read it. And there are different opinions. There are some who think that, yes, the Masorah was actually read because, the text makes sense. It's not, whatever they copied. These are Masoretic lists that are correct. And some others think, well, at a certain point, the Masorah was meaningless, and it was used just for, to make these Bibles pretty. So there are different opinions on that. And in my opinion, I think the Masorah was, at least for some people, it was read by some, some persons that were familiar with the copying of biblical manuscripts and were familiar with the biblical text as well. So for educated people, let's say, and many people were. It was a sign of prestige to have one of these beautiful Bibles, with Masorah copied with this micrographic script. So again, it's confusing for everybody, the use of the Masorah. And then your last question, sorry, was.
Did they use the Sephardic selections for the Haftarah?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I haven't mentioned it, but yeah, the selection of Haftarot differs a little bit from the Sephardic tradition to the Ashkenazi, for instance, or other. So every liturgical tradition, there are slight changes in the selection of the Haftarot, and in this case, the Sephardic Bibles they offer the list of Haftarot according to the Sephardic rite. Yes, thank you.
Right. So we have a couple questions from the excuse me, online audience, and I'll give one now, and then we can go to a live question or in-person question. So Marcia Kupfer asks or says, "Thank you for your presentation," and asks, "Can you elaborate on the reasons for the special visual treatment of the Song of the Sea and other poetic sections? Was it to mark a change of voice or genre?"
What was the last thing you said? Sorry.
Was it to mark a change of voice or genre?
Well, to me, the different layouts of the poetic sections, and in particular of the Song of the Sea. Sorry. Yeah. I think that they are following different scribal traditions, not particularly personal traditions, but we could say schools, right? Because this particular layout is commonly found in many Sephardic Bibles, and this is not the only layout that you can find in a Sephardic Bible. There are different considerations, if you, because to put the Song of the Sea into this layout, you need a Bible with columns of 21 lines, right? So the Bible should have a specific it has to be it needs to have specific measures. So if it's a bigger volume, if it's a bigger book, you can't arrange the text in this layout. So you can find other layouts. But even if the layouts of the Song of the Sea depends on some external, I would say, considerations, there are certain trends of arranging the text for the Song of the Sea. For example, I'm just finishing with that. For example, if you have a Bible copied in 3 columns instead of 2, like these that we have seen, the arrangement of the Song of the Sea changes. And sometimes they just take the space of 2 columns to arrange the poem, and then you have the 3rd column also on the page. So there are different considerations, but I wouldn't say that this is, that this is a personal option of the scribe. I think most of them are following different scribal traditions.
I have a quick question because I didn't know that Megillat Antiochus had such a prominence in this tradition. Can you talk a little bit either about its reception history in Ashkenaz or how it comes in? What is its other afterlife?
You mean
outside of the biblical layout of the page? How else is it functioning in Sepharad?
Outside the biblical manuscript, for instance? Well, this is... I don't know, really. The Megillat Antiochus is a text that is known in all the Jewish traditions. It's not that this is a text just known for Sephardic Jews. No, it's an old text, and it circulates among the different Jewish communities. The special thing I would say here for Sephardic Jews is that they incorporate it sometimes to the biblical codices. To me, this is the special point.
I can just put a footnote on the scroll of Antiochus, Megillat Antiochus. My understanding, I think it comes from Neubauer, who said that this originally Babylonian Aramaic formulation of the Hanukkah story was promoted by I think Saadia Gaon, or maybe even prior to Saadia Gaon, because of the Karaites did not accept Hanukkah, which is a non-biblical holiday. And so that's when it became very important, and a Hebrew translation, I think, was made in the 7th century, and a Judeo-Arabic translation was made. And as Professor Del Barco said, it did circulate not only in Sfarad, but it's interesting to learn from you that only in the codices, the Bible codices of Sfarad, was it included.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was curious if you could speak within the case studies that you've looked at a little bit more about the sort of process of wayfinding, which goes back to some of the questions we've looked at or that other people have asked around how someone would navigate these texts. Clearly, there's a distinction between the beginning of the Haftarot and the end of the Torah, but are there in any of these, for instance, indications of where a parasha begins and ends? Would, for instance, the end of Bamidbar to Devarim, would that require a different page, or would that just be, you would skip a couple lines to indicate the beginning of a new book? Sort of what would we expect in that sort of layout?
Yeah, thank you. Exactly. In the I'm trying to put one of the pages of the beginning. Yeah, for the Pentateuch, for instance, it is very in the first, in the bifolium here. We can observe, I think, yeah, and here also in the other manuscripts, it is very common to find, the indications of parasha in the margin. So this is very common in Sephardic Bibles, at least, to find in the margins the indication of the beginning of a parasha. Right, and it's almost always with these three letters, Pe, Resh, Shin, and so just with a quick look, you know where the different parashot begin. Then you know also that the text of the Torah is arranged in scrolls as well as in codices according to the different piskaot. So there are what we call open piskaot and closed piskaot. So just having a look at the different paragraphs, one who is accustomed, to read the biblical text from one of these codices can follow the different piskaot, right? With the you find them throughout the Pentateuch. Then in the Haftarot, it's in a chumash of this kind. It would be much easier because they usually I don't know if I have, yes. Oops. Sorry. Oh yeah. Yeah, you usually have in larger letters the name of the parasha that corresponds to the Haftarah. So you have here Bereshit, and you have the Haftarah corresponding to Bereshit, and so on in the rest of the Haftarot. So there are certain devices that are used to navigate in the text in these Bibles. Then, by the end of the Middle Ages, particularly since the 15th century, readers would feel the need to add more devices to navigate in the text. So they started to add running titles to make clearer where they are, and other devices. Yeah.
Thank you. I wish we had a lot more time for questions, but we do have time for questions over snacks. And please join me in thanking Professor Del Barco.
Thank you very much.